Hello everyone, welcome to a new video. This is just a quick video about program mode on your SLR camera. It's a basic mode that's used for people that don't want to know all the ins and outs of using the camera, or someone who's just basically wants a point and shoot camera that they don't have to spend a lot of time in deciphering on how it works. So program mode on most your Rebel and 500 and 600D cameras will be named as P on the dial or PA+ dependent, and you can literally only mainly control the aperture and the shutter speed. The ISO is locked into an auto mode. So if we just get hold of my little diagram that I've drawn here, hopefully you can see that. So basically what you need to know is you want your shutter speed and your aperture to balance each other, and the program mode will take care of the ISO. So your ISO is how sensitive your sensor is, your shutter speed is how fast the shutter will take your picture, and your aperture is how big the iris gets. So as you can see, I've got some images here ranging from f1.4, which has a large hole to let lots of light in, f4 is a bit smaller, and f8 and f16 get really small. However, having a really small aperture means your depth of field is quite large, so you get a lot of your foreground and your background in focus. For example, f8 is pretty normally expected to get a good amount of depth of field. However, if you need to have a large opening aperture like f2.8 for example, it limits your depth of field. So you reduce your depth of field, but it lets a lot of light in, which means your shutter speed can be higher. The more light you've got, the higher your shutter speed can be, and the faster picture you can take, which means you've got a good chance of freezing action. The thing is, when you end up having a slow shutter speed, you've got a chance of introducing motion blur into your shot, and unfortunately that can give you quite a rubbish photograph. So it's always a balancing act. You've got to balance your shutter speed with your aperture and your ISO, which is your sensor sensitivity. I know this can get quite complex, and to the novice it can be quite confusing. So I don't want to dwell too much on different settings for you guys, because it can get confusing. So what I recommend as a beginner is start out on P mode or PA+, depending on your camera. If it's a Rebel, it'll just be P mode, and what you'll find is it tends to grey out most of your settings on your camera, so you can only really adjust your aperture and your shutter speed by moving the dial, and that will adjust how fast your shutter speed is, and obviously make your aperture smaller or larger. So in terms of some of these cameras have an inbuilt flash as well, so sometimes that will pop up automatically because it's in the program mode. If it gets too dark, the camera decides you need your flash on to take a picture. The only problem with some cameras are if you put a really large lens on, the flash can't get over the size of your lens, and you'll end up with some dark shadows in your photograph. So in those instances, I would recommend you pop on a hot shoe flash where it can go that way over the lens, so the lens doesn't protrude and doesn't block any light in your photograph. So without further ado, I'll just show you what it looks like at the back end. If you feel a bit more confident in taking pictures and you want to experiment with a more advanced mode, I would personally choose even someone like myself that can do manual photography in manual mode, which is the M mode on the button, quite competently. I do prefer aperture priority mode. Now that is actually labelled as AV on the dial, and what that means is you can control through your dials the aperture, how wide the hole gets and how small it gets, as well as your shutter speed with the back dial. Other cameras may not have a back dial, and you may just have like a D-pad that you can use, but essentially it does the same thing. You can increase your aperture or make it smaller with, say, the top button there, and then the back dial or D-pad, you'll be able to adjust your shutter speed, how quickly the picture is taken. In terms of ISO, now that's the sensitivity I mentioned. You can adjust that by pressing the ISO button on the top. Other cameras may have that button elsewhere, and what I would recommend is, as a beginner, as a new starter, put your ISO onto A. That means automatic. So wherever you point your camera, there's an inbuilt light meter actually inside the camera, and if you have it on automatic for the ISO, that's the sensor sensitivity. The camera will automatically adjust the ISO, and you won't need to think about that. I recommend it as a new starter. Start out with ISO settings set to A for automatic, and then you can use the top dial for adjusting the aperture, and if you need to, you can also adjust the compensation dial that's on the bottom there. I'll show you that in a minute, with the back dial or the D-pad, and that's your shutter speed. And hopefully this video is going to be helpful to you guys. So we're set up in program mode at the moment. As you can see, our ISO is already set to automatic, and here are our settings. We've got our shutter speed there. I'll just get that back on there. Shutter speed there at 60th of a second. Our aperture set to 5.6. ISO is automatically selected at 1600 because it's on auto, and it's a simple issue of just pressing the button, and because the light is quite dim, the flash will pop up automatically. But I just wanted to show you more or less what it's showing on the LCD. Now, I appreciate not all Rebel cameras will have an LCD, so we'll need to have a look at the back of the camera to see what you can select in the actual settings for program mode. So just quickly looking on the back here, you can just see the flash icon, single shot, everything is greyed out, so you can't select anything. So this tells us that in program mode you've got just basic settings in order to take a picture, and it all does it automatically. So the light meter inside the program mode does it all for you. So if you're just looking for something in terms of basic to take pictures, program mode is the best option for you to select. So here's the dial. So obviously you can select program mode. On some cameras it may be PA+, like this 7D Mark II, but on most Rebels it will be just P for program mode, which I would call beginner mode. If you want to get a little bit more into advanced photography and have a bit more freedom in terms of your settings, I would recommend that you choose AV mode. That's aperture priority, and you control your aperture and everything else is dictated by that choice. So if we just bring over the LCD here and have a look at what we can see that our aperture is selected at f4, shutter speed is set at 30th of a second, ISO there is at 500, but it is actually set on auto at the moment. If we want to change that, we can just press the ISO button, and that will allow me to adjust the ISO and set it to a set standard. So if I want it to be relatively sensitive, remember when you raise the sensitivity you introduce noise or grain into your images, so you don't want to go too high. I would certainly recommend never go above 1600 on a Rebel or an APS-C camera, and try and keep it as low as possible if you can. But that's why it's a good idea to have a lens with a big aperture that lets a lot of light in. But you can set that to say 320th, gives us a shutter speed of 25th of a second, and with aperture f4. Changing the dial here will allow me to change the aperture, and as you can see the shutter speed is dropping down. We can change that by increasing the ISO. Press the ISO, and let's just raise that up to 800. Press again, and as you can see our shutter speed has doubled because we've increased the ISO, the sensitivity. Again, let's just see what happens when I change that to 400 ISO, and it should drop the shutter speed, and as you can see it's 13th of a second. So you know, aperture priority is a little bit more thinking towards it, but it gives you more control. So that's your triangle. So you've got your shutter speed at 13th of a second there, your aperture set to 5.6, and your ISO is set at 400. But this gives you a good visual aid in determining, is it fast enough? Is 13th of a second fast enough to freeze action? No, it isn't. So we need to increase that aperture and make it bigger. 6.3 is smaller, we want to go bigger, so get it to f4. Is 25th of a second fast enough to freeze action in general use? No, we need to get to at least 60th of a second. So let's just adjust our ISO a bit more. We want to be a lot higher. Let's try 1000th ISO, and let's just press the shutter and see. You depress the shutter a little bit just to see what it's giving us. So we've reached 60th of a second. That's the minimum, I would say, at around 50mm we need to freeze action at f4. And if we press all the way, that will take a picture, and that you know, is telling us that because the flash didn't pop up, it's saying we've got enough shutter speed, enough light getting into the sensor to take a picture. However, if we drop that down and let's change our ISO to something a lot smaller, obviously the smaller we go, the cleaner the image is, like 100 ISO for example. As you can see, it sounded a lot slower, and we would get image blur into that. So we need to raise our ISO a lot more than that, to something like this. And let's just see how this shutter sounds. A lot quicker. So you need a faster shutter speed to freeze action, but if it gets dark, what you need to do is get that ISO, the aperture lower, so it goes to f4. There are other lenses that will go down a lot more than that. So let's just bring our board back. So as I've stated, you need a larger hole to let a lot more light in. So in one particular lens I've loaned out, gives us an aperture of 2.8, and that lets a lot more light in, and it gives you a fighting chance of getting a sharp image even in low light situations. So you know, just remember that if you need to get your aperture lower in order to take a good picture. But so if you're just starting out, guys, select the P or P plus mode, and the camera will take care of everything for you, and you won't need to do anything with it. Occasionally you may want to use a flash on the top. Right, in aperture priority mode we have a lot more options here, and things are not grayed out. So I just wanted to show you the back of it. You can literally control everything from the back of the screen if you're using one of the Rebels that don't have an LCD screen, such as ISO, white balance, exposure compensation, and you know, the size of your image as well, using the various controls on the back. So if your camera isn't quite the same as this, don't worry too much. You can access all the settings on the back of the LCD screen. Okay, so if you just want to quickly change the settings in terms of the file size of the pictures you're taking, a quick way of doing that is just press the cube on and then press the set button on the file size, and you can choose to have raw images or JPEGs or both, because it can do both at the same time. For the beginner, I would recommend you just take JPEGs. You've got obviously a large, medium and small that you can take, because you can't use raw images unfortunately on most social media sites if you want to upload pictures. So I would certainly recommend just stick to JPEG and ignore the raw images. You can have raw if you want, just by moving the top dial you can choose raw as well. However, I would just recommend you stick to JPEG as a beginner, and you know, just choose large. That, like selecting that, and just press the set button, and that choose that, and now you're on JPEG now. Hopefully that helps you out in determining what file size you want.